Chapter 4, Responsibility. Jaune. Carden. The respective teams called out simultaneously to their downed leaders. The RDL of Team CRDL rushed to their leader, helping him up and checking on his breathing. Meanwhile Nora, Pyrrha, and Ren all shot out of their seats as well, running towards the back of the amphitheater where their leader lay. They were halfway across the hall when a familiar purple glow enveloped them, lifting them up into the air. Ren and Pyrrha were shocked, but realized what was happening and begrudgingly stopped resisting Professor Goodwich's semblance. Nora, however, twisted and howled, trying to break free to no avail. The trio were placed back in their seats as Glinda Goodwich made her way towards the young Ark, the sharp clicks of her heels silencing everyone in the room. Jaune had made it up to his knees by the time Goodwich arrived beside him. "Mr. Ark, you will see me after class, is that understood?" Glinda's authoritative tone brooked no argument. She was far less than pleased with how this spar turned out. Mr. Ark did not respond. That only further served to aggravate Glinda. She stepped forward to further discipline the boy when she noticed something. Jaune did not look unruly or delinquent, something she'd expect a person that would ignore the rules of the arena and Glinda's own orders. Instead, she saw that Jaune was shaking, struggling to even support himself. Tears formed at the corners of his eyes, and his mouth failed to even form the most basic of words. This was not the face of someone who would abuse his powers for sadistic pleasure. This was the terrified face of a child in shock of what he had just done. Glinda looked down at the boy, and understood he needed help right now, not later. "Team CRDL." She shouted, getting the boys to all look at her with both respect and fear. "Take your leader to the infirmary. Ensure that there was no permanent damage." The boys all nodded and quickly left with Carden, both Sky and Bronze supporting him on their shoulders. Glinda then turned her attention to everyone else in the class, who immediately clammed up to avoid drawing Goodwich's ire. "Everyone, I am sorry to say that class is dismissed early. You are free to do as you like for the remainder of this period. As for you, Mr. Ark." Glinda slowly turned her head towards the boy, who fearfully looked up at her. "You will be coming with me to my office. Now." Before Jaune even had the chance to respond, he was coated in the professor's semblance, causing him to float directly behind Goodwich as she left the arena. Jaune soon found himself placed upon a rather comfortable chair. It was an oak chair with velvet upholstered seat cushion, fancy. The comfort of the seat was overtaken by the discomfort of the room he was in. Behind her desk, Glinda Goodwich sat in her chair staring directly at him. Jaune thought the office itself was rather Goodwich-esque, in that it was only furnished with 2 fully filled bookcases, her desk which contained her computer and a stack of paperwork, and a printout of her Huntress license displayed behind her. Jaune couldn't meet Professor Goodwich's gaze. He looked down sullenly, his lips pursed into a thin line. Jaune didn't know what was going on, or what he was feeling. A large part of him felt ashamed for attacking Carden like that, another was confused as to where such feelings of anger came from. Glinda sighed. Despite her public persona of a no-nonsense, domineering educator, she was only ever strict with her students because she wanted to build them up and prepare them for the terrors of the huntsman's life. Seeing students break was not something she found pleasure in. Telekinetically, Glinda brought an electric kettle and some tea to her desk. As the water began to boil, she floated 2 porcelain teacups and a teapot before Jaune and herself. Jaune watched in confusion as his professor started steeping the tea within its pot, before pouring the 2 of them a cup. Jaune's gaze apprehensively flickered between her and the teacup, before he muttered out, "Thanks," and started reaching for the cup. Before Jaune could grab the teacup, however, Glinda placed her riding crop on the top of his hand, stopping him. "No. Lift the cup with your semblance, as so." The teacup in front of Glinda glowed purple, hovering for a few seconds before gently being placed back onto the table. Nodding, Jaune began to focus on the teacup. Jaune understood the basics of moving things with his mind without having to resort to funneling his emotions, but he'd never done anything as delicate as this. Wrapping the cup in his invisible force, the teacup began to shake and teeter as it slowly rose inch by inch. Tea spilled from its container as the teacup shook violently. Jaune's frustration only grew as he was unable to stabilize the cup, boiling over until the teacup rocketed upwards, shattering upon the ceiling and raining glass and tea upon the two of them. John closed his eyes and ducked, hoping to avoid the shards. But Glinda created a glyph above them, blocking the shattered remains of the glassware. Silently, she then lifted the pieces, as well as the tea itself, and deposited them into a trash bin. John cringed as he heard the glass land at the bottom of the container. Glinda only sighed again. "Mr. Ark, how long has it been since you unlocked your semblance and aura?" John felt like he was punched in the stomach by that question. John had lied on the transcript, embellishing his skills and grades in combat school, so he would have had to have his aura unlocked for a while. On the other hand, he was pretty sure Glinda would be able to spot any lie he would attempt to breathe out and then defenestrate him with her semblance. His only choice was to go for the vague, general response that could maybe answer the question. "You know, I heard that there was this scientist up in Atlas, who says that time is actually a relative phenomenon. So from a certain perspective, the amount of time that I may or may not have had my semblance would be considered a while." John's asshole was jealous of the pure shit coming out of his mouth. Glinda, however, was not amused by his rambling and slammed her writing prop against the desk, the resounding quack immediately silencing the boy. "Mr. Ark, stop dancing around the question and answer me. Now." John immediately sat up straight. "I unlocked my aura right before coming to Beacon, and found my semblance during initiation, ma'am." Glinda's stern, neutral face morphed into a frown. "Mr. Ark, you have a powerful semblance, much like my own. However, telekinetics like us must train twice as hard at the usage of our semblances, not only for the potential benefits it can provide, but because of the potential harm we can do. You have been gifted a great power, and have such a great responsibility. You are far too inexperienced with your powers. If you cannot learn to control them, it is only a matter of time before you hurt or possibly kill someone." John felt the weight of every word Professor Goodwich was saying. He'd been getting through with his semblance thus far, but that's all been luck and instinct. What if he accidentally hurt Ruby or White in initiation because he couldn't properly grab them? Too much force and he could have crushed them to death. Not enough and they would have broken through his semblance and fallen to the ground. John was snapped out of his introspection as Glinda continued her speech. "You will either come work directly with me to gain control of your powers, or you may look to your partner and team to aid you in this endeavor. I do not care which path you choose, so long as a choice is made. You must get your powers under control. Is that clear, Mr. Ark?" Mr. Ark nodded his head furiously. "Yes, Professor Goodwich. Crystal." Glinda gave a small nod, accepting his response. "Good. Now then you may return to friends." John sat up from his chair and immediately made for the door. While on an intellectual level he could understand that Professor Goodwich only wanted to help him, she still intimidated the daylights out of him and he wasn't going to stay here for any longer than he needed. Exiting the professor's office, John gently closed the door and was about to make his way towards the dorms. He stopped when his sixth sense alerted him that he was being watched. Snapping his head towards the source of this disturbance, John let out a relaxed breath as he saw both the rest of Team JNPR and all of Team RWBY poking their heads around a corner. As soon as they were made, all of his friends rushed to John's side and began bombarding him with questions. "John, what did you do in the arena? Are you okay? Were you injured? Did Professor Goodwich touch you anywhere?" John was so overwhelmed by the questions that he didn't even know who was asking what. "Wait, what?" John blurted out as his brain processed the last question. "No, guys, I'm fine, everything is fine. I'll tell you what the professor and I talked about. Just not here, in front of her office." John felt his stomach rumble. "In fact, how about we go to the cafeteria? I'll fill you all in over lunch." So, there we were, in the middle of the night. Nora's voice rang out over ambient noise of the cafeteria. It was day. Ren dead. We were surrounded by her sigh. Nora hissed out to an uninterested crowd. Ren took a sip of his tea. They were Beowulfs. Dozens of them. Nora cried out as she jumped up onto the table. Majority of the listeners were unimpressed by the display. Blake and Weiss had no reservations at completely ignoring Nora, too invested in their book and nails respectively. Ruby and Pyrrha were politely listening, but not really invested, while John absent-mindedly pushed the remains of his food around his plate. Yang seemed to be the only one who actually cared about the story. Two of them, Ren added on. But they were no match. And in the end, Ren and I took them down and made a boatload of lean selling Ursa skin rugs. Nora finished, sitting down with a proud look of accomplishment on her face. Ren sighed. She's been having this recurring dream for nearly a month now. Ruby and Pyrrha shared a glance with each other before looking at the currently morose John. Pyrrha was the first to speak up. So John, now that aside is over, can you tell us what Professor Goodwich said? Huh. Oh yeah, sure, I did say I was going to tell you. John sighed as he put down his fork. The gist of the conversation was Professor Goodwich hammering me for not having control over my semblance, saying that I could really hurt someone if I don't get it under control. And she's right. I don't have that much control over my semblance really, especially since I pretty much just unlocked my aura. John hung his head in shame. That's the reason I almost hurt Cardin in class today. She pretty much told me I need extra training to get it under control, either doing extra classes with her or with someone else. That confession got everyone's attention. Most of them didn't know John had only recently unlocked his aura, especially with how skillfully he fought. And the idea of doing extra classes with Professor Goodwich did not sound appealing to anyone. Well, I'm sure we'd all be happy to help train you, John. Ruby cried out, puffing her chest out in a stereotypical leader pose, speaking for her whole team without their consent. Indeed, John. We are all here to help you, all you need to do is ask. There is no shame in needing to train a new skill, John. Especially something as complicated as a semblance, many could train for years and still struggle with controlling their powers. Pyrrha added on. Weiss gave a small cough, trying to cover up her internal embarrassment at Pyrrha's comment. Despite training for years, the young heiress still did not have as much control over her glyphs as she would like. Yeah, John, believe me, I totally sucked when I first unlocked my semblance. Ruby added on. I didn't know how to really slow down when I started, and would always wind up crashing into a bunch of walls and doors and stuff. Ruby laughed as the memories came back to her. John nodded his head, before turning to the rest of his team, as well as the rest of Team RWBY. What do you guys think? Weiss put down her nail file. Additional training will never be a bad thing, Ard. As someone who is also heavily reliant on their semblance in combat, training our minds and auras are just as important as Yang training her gorilla muscles. Hey! Yang let out an indignant cry. Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Ren sagely added on. You cannot expect to grow as a person and a huntsman if you do not master who you already are. That makes sense, I think. John replied. Yeah, thanks for the talk, guys. Oh, before his train of thought was interrupted by a cry of pain. Ow. That hurts. An unknown voice cried out. Please, stop. I told you it was real. They all heard Cardin's voice boom over the cry of pain. Everyone turned to the source of the noise. There, they saw Cardin Winchester and his team of lackeys surrounding another student, a rabbit faunus with long hazel hair. Everyone scowled at the blatant display of bigotry. Atrocious. I can't stand people like him. Pyrrha hissed out. Blake meanwhile stared daggers at the boy. He's not the only one. John felt a myriad of emotions, primarily those of pity and disgust. He pitied the young woman being harassed, and felt only contempt for Cardin. John glanced at his friends, and realized that none of them seemed poised to intervene. That only caused John to steel himself further. If no one else wanted to say something, he would. It's what a hero would do. Don't you think that's enough, Cardin? John called out, causing everyone at his table to look at him. Cardin, having heard the challenge, looked at the source of the voice and saw John. He immediately snarled and let go of the girl's ear. Cardin stood up and walked towards John and Co. The rest of Team CRDL glanced between one another, before also standing to support their leader. The faunus girl took the opportunity to quickly flee the scene. Nora, Yang, and Pyrrha all rose, shifting into slightly defensive stances in case anything went down. Cardin continued his stride towards John, and looked down on the seated Ark, anger radiating off of him. Cardin, just drop it, man. It's not worth it. Jaune neutrally spoke, unfazed by the Winchester's attempt at intimidation. Carden's eyes were fixed on Jaune for a moment, and for the briefest of moments glazed over before he grunted and turned around. Come on boys, let's drop it. This isn't worth it. As Carden walked away, the rest of his team gave some small acknowledgements and left as well. Everyone else in the table was shocked that Carden would give up so easily. They turned to face Jaune, eyes wide, and he only shrugged. Guess he must be more scared than angry over combat class today, was the only conclusion that came to Jaune's mind as he took a sip from his juice box. Damn, Vomit Boy must really have a silver tongue, Yang commented. Seeing that Jaune was currently drinking, she knew she had the perfect opportunity for some teasing. I wonder what else the tongue can do. She purred out loud enough for everyone to hear. Jaune squeezed his juice box hard at the comment, sending fruit juice out his nose as he choked on the liquid. Yang grabbed her stomach, bellowing with laughter as her sister berated her for her disgusting innuendos. Pyrrha meanwhile blushed red while grabbing tissues for her leader to cover up his shame. Chapter 5. Control. Following lunch, teams Ch.4 and RWBY were faced with one of their greatest challenges, Dr. Oobleck's class. Now, Jaune had never considered himself a poor student, nor a slacker. At his previous school, he passed with straight B's, and never found himself lost in class. Right now, however, Jaune desperately struggled to keep his eyelids open as the good doctor zipped around the front of the classroom, espousing his knowledge to the classroom full of learners. Yes, prior to the Faunus Rights Revolution, more popularly known as the Faunus War, Dr. Oobleck was currently teaching the class about the final battles of the Faunus War. And while Jaune would normally find such a subject fascinating, the speed at which the doctor was talking made it difficult for him to retain anything he was hearing. As Jaune's eyes slowly closed, he didn't notice the resident bully Carden folding a paper football behind him. Jaune let his head rest in his hands, as the paper football was kicked, aimed straight for the back of Jaune's head. It was then that Jaune's sixth sense kicked in. Sensing something behind him, Jaune immediately tilted his head to the side, flawlessly dodging the paper triangle. Carden watched in horror as the football sailed through the air, past Ark, smacking right into Dr. Oobleck's chest. Everyone froze as the football hit the doctor, falling to the ground with a light pat. As the good doctor bent down to pick the football up, his gaze fell upon the trajectory of the projectile, leading him right back to Carden. The entire class turned and stared at Carden, with various gawking expressions of disbelief. It wasn't me, Carden weakly fibbed. Yes, and I suppose this papyrus pigskin just seemingly apparated out of thin air. That must be quite the useful semblance, if true, Mr. Winchester. Dr. Oobleck quickly jabbed. Was all Carden had to respond with. Detention. Dr. Oobleck shouted out as he threw the paper football back at Carden. The folded paper spun like a shuriken, buzzing through the air as it embedded itself in the wood with a heavy thud behind Carden, who ducked with a terrified expression. Now then, back to the lesson. Mr. Ark, what advantage did the Faunus have over General Lagoon's forces in the Battle of Fort Castle? Jaune mentally cursed. The lecture was so boring that he barely paid attention to it, and Dr. Oobleck was enough of an expert on the subject matter that his bullshit detector was state-of-the-art. Jaune glanced around him, looking for anything on the board or in his notes that might give him the answer. Then from behind him, he heard a quiet voice whisper out. The answer is night vision, Jaune. He quickly identified it as his partner, Pyrrha. Jaune took a quick peek over his shoulder, and saw his partner giving him a binocular-like gesture, raising both her hands in circles over her eyes. Jaune gave a quick eyebrow raise to her, before swiftly turning back to the doctor, who was still awaiting his answer. Night vision? Jaune more asked than answered. Dr. Oobleck stared Jaune down, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, before immediately shooting up, yelling, correct. General Lagoon was not aware that the Faunus had natural night vision capabilities. His inexperience led him to attempt to ambush the Faunus in their sleep. This, obviously, was a mistake, leading to his army being outmatched, and the general himself being captured. Now, moving on. As the doctor continued on with his lesson, Jaune glanced back at Pyrrha again, and gave her a small thumbs up. Pyrrha nodded with a smile, before returning to her notes. As they were dismissed, the students began to go on their separate ways as classes were done for the day. Team RWBY broke off to return to their dorm and rest their tired brains, waving goodbye to their JNPR comrades. So, what's the plan now? Nora asked, kicking her legs down the hallway with her arms behind her head. Jaune glanced at Valkyrie, then at his partner. Bringing a hand to his chin, he had an idea. I think I'll go get something from the vending machines. You want to come with Pyr? My treat, as thanks for helping me out in class. Pyrrha smiled. Sure. I won't be one to question a gift. Nora's eyes lit up as she saw an opportunity for her two teammates to have some time alone. There were few people in the world she shipped as hard as her fearless leader and invincible teammate. I could also use a refreshment, Ren blankly said at the head of the group. With a speed that rivaled Ruby, Nora flashed right up to Ren and elbowed him in the ribs. Jaune and Pyrrha swore they heard a crack as Ren collapsed then and there. Oh Ren, are you tired? Hey, why don't you guys go on ahead? I'll take Rennie here back to the room. Nora pet Ren's head as she ran away with his unconscious body. Should we be worried about that? Jaune asked, turning to face his partner. I don't think so. They do have their together, but not together relationship after all. Perhaps this is normal. Pyrrha shrugged. Jaune shrugged as well as the duo left to go get their refreshments. After a quick trip to the nearby vending machine, Jaune had purchased both of them cans of People Like Grapes soda. Just wanted to say thanks for the help in class Pyr. Jaune said as he popped open his soda. It's not that I don't like history, but I'll be honest, Dr. Oobleck's class is the worst. It's no problem, Jaune. Partners are supposed to help each other out. I'm just glad you were able to decipher my hand gestures. Pyrrha gave a slight smile while she sipped on her own soda. She didn't indulge in sugary drinks often, so she was taking her time. Jaune shot Pyrrha a confused look. I thought you whispered the answer to me. Pyrrha's brows furrowed. I didn't do anything like that. That's weird. Jaune thought back on the class. He was sure that Pyrrha was the one who told him the answer. Perhaps someone else whispered it. She suggested. Maybe. Jaune looked down, confused, before turning back to Pyrrha with a joking smile. Maybe I came up with the answer on my own and it was just your voice inside of my head. Pyrrha went a little red at the suggestion. But before she could respond, a shoulder bumped into Jaune, shoving him forward. Jaune stumbled forward and Pyrrha moved to catch him. Looking up, the duo saw that it was none other than Cardin Winchester, having just left his one-on-one talk with Dr. Oobleck, that so rudely shoved Jaune. As they watched Cardin turn the corner, Jaune felt his anger well up inside him. Not wanting to directly hurt the boy, Jaune directed his anger anywhere else. The result was a grinding crunch as his semblance crushed his mostly full can of soda, spraying purple liquid all over himself. Jaune and Pyrrha looked in shock at his ruined beverage, then at his sticky self. Jaune let out an exasperated sigh as he let his semblance go out of control again. Quickly, Pyrrha pulled out a handkerchief and started drying off her partner. You know, I really will break his legs, she whispered to Jaune. Looking her dejected partner up and down, Pyrrha resolved herself to do whatever it took to help him, even more so than before. I have an idea. Come with me. Pyrrha grabbed Jaune by the arm and dragged him through the corridors of Beacon. The JN of Team JNPR soon found themselves on the rooftop of Beacon's first-year dormitory. Jaune took in the view. He could see the glowing, green orbs of Beacon's central tower contrast against the setting red-orange sun. It was a beautiful sight, he had to admit. Quite a view, he mumbled. So Pyr, why'd you bring me all the way up here? You finally get tired of my leadership, and come to claim it for your own? He jokingly asked. Pyrrha, however, was horrified by the suggestion. What? No, I would never do something like that. Jaune internally chuckled but kept a straight face. You sure? Could take me down in hand to hand, then throw me off the roof. Could say it was a suicide. The fall would cover up the injuries. Not a bad plan if I do say so myself. Pyrrha walked up to Jaune, and smacked him on the side of the head. No, Jaune, I am not here to assassinate you, and I'd rather not discuss such a morbid topic. Jaune, I brought you up here because I think we could train your semblance together here. Just like Professor Goodwich suggested. Pyrrha then grabbed his hand and pulled him away from the edge. Your swordplay is at a high level already, so I think we could focus on your mental and semblance training. Jaune nodded his head. It made sense, and Pyrrha did have a relatively similar resemblance to him. Yeah, I suppose, he drawled out. Pyrrha frowned. You seem unsure. Jaune paused for a moment, thinking about his words. I think the professor was only partially right about my problem. I think it's less about my inexperience with my semblance, but more of my lack of control over my emotions. How do you mean? Pyrrha tilted her head. You remember how during the initiation, I had to use my fear to save Weiss and Ruby from falling? Jaune asked. Pyrrha nodded her head. Well, I think that my semblance is somehow directly tied to my emotions. When I saved the two of them, it was fear that I felt. When I attacked Cardin, or when I just crushed the can, it was anger. The more anger or fear I feel, the stronger my abilities are, but the less control I have over them. He explained. Pyrrha thought about this. Well, Jaune, that's not wholly uncommon with semblances. Yang's semblance seems to be fueled by anger, while I can also lose control of my semblance if I get too emotional. She then placed a hand on Jaune's shoulder. It's not a weakness to get angry, Jaune. It's human. Jaune pulled away from her touch, causing her to frown. That's not it, he mumbled. It's not that I'm ashamed that I have to use my anger to get stronger. It's more that I'm scared of what I can do with this power. What do you mean by that? Jaune sighed. Before I explain, I want you to promise me something, Pyr. Promise that you won't think I'm crazy. Pyrrha's frown deepened. Jaune, what are you talking about? What's going on? Please, Pyr. I need to hear you say it. Jaune pushed. Pyrrha felt Jaune's desperation, and so she resolved herself, adopting a serious demeanor. Jaune, I promise on my name that I will not think you are crazy. Thank you, really. Jaune whispered, before slapping himself in the face to get ready for his confession. I've been having dreams. Dreams are memories or visions or something, of someone. Of someone that I don't know, that I've never met, who has the same semblance that I do. It's only happened a few times, like before initiation, and before my fight with Cardin. And I watch this person fight. He's terrifying but amazing at the same time. I could feel what he feels during the dream, how he feeds off his anger and cruelty, his semblance becoming stronger as he hurts people. And the thing is, whatever this man does in my dreams, I seem to be able to do as well. Pyrrha's mouth hung open. Her initial reaction was sheer disbelief. But she immediately recalled her promise to Jaune, and kept an open mind. How is that possible? Was all she could ask. I don't know. Pyr, listen, I shouldn't even be at Beacon. I had to forge my transcripts and lie to get in. Jaune confessed. What? But you're an amazing fighter. Why would you have to forge your transcripts? That's another thing. Pyrrha, before initiation, I held Crocea Morse 2, maybe 3 times. Ever. I never actually learned how to fight. Jaune yelled. Pyrrha was now seeing the pattern. If that's true, and if you can do whatever you see the man in your dreams do, then all of your combat skills are also copied from this man. Jaune nodded. Yeah. Against the Deathstalker, against Cardin. All of those moves were moves I stole from the man whose memories I've been watching. No training, no practice. It's like I was just given all these abilities as soon as my aura awakened. And you're afraid of becoming like this man. Yeah, I mean, he's a great fighter, but at least in the last dream, he was cruel. Sadistic. I want to be a hero, not whatever it is he was. Jaune felt only anger at his situation. Anger at the lack of control he was having over his life, over his lack of knowledge of who this man was. It made him feel helpless and emasculated. Pyrrha pondered all of this information dumped on her. Perhaps your semblance is actually some sort of reincarnation, giving you the talents and abilities of a past life. Pyrrha couldn't believe what she was saying. It sounded like something out of a science fiction comic. Is that even possible? John was flabbergasted. All honesty, I have no idea. But it does fit. Aura and semblances aren't exactly a hard science. Pyrrha shook her head before grabbing John's face with both her hands. But listen, John. It doesn't matter if your semblance, or your skills were from a past life or not. They are your abilities now, and you are responsible for them. I thank you for telling me this, for trusting me with this explanation. But it doesn't change your situation. You need training. If you don't want to become like the man in your dreams, then you have to gain control of your emotions. If you don't, we may not be able to trust you on the battlefield. So let us help you get that control. Pyrrha practically begged. This was too important for John to just shrug off and deal with alone. John nodded his head. Yeah, I know. Thanks Pyr, I really mean it. You're right. I can't do this alone. You'd really be willing to help me. Pyrrha smiled and hugged her leader. Of course, John. And I'm sure Ren would be more than happy to help as well. Emotional control is sorta his thing. Pyrrha then let go of John and gave him a serious look. That all being said, if Ren and I are to focus on helping you control your emotions, I think it would be best if you take up Professor Goodwich's offer on training as well. John grimaced. Do I have to? Professor Goodwich still intimidated the hell out of him. Yes, John, I believe you do. While we can help you manage your emotions, Professor Goodwich is still the best person to teach you the intricacies of telekinesis. We can help keep you from exploding and losing control, but she can teach you advanced techniques and maneuvers that you might not have thought possible. Pyrrha argued. John hung his head like a scolded child and mumbled, All right, fine, I'll go see Professor Goodwich about extra lessons. Pyrrha had a satisfied smirk and gave John a pat on the head. Good. Now come on, let's head back. We'll need to talk to Ren about a lesson plan for your training. John looked out over the horizon. The sun had set and the evening sky was now a dark purple. Why don't you go back ahead, Pyr? I'll stay up here for a bit to clear my head. Pyrrha smiled and nodded, going back to the dorm ahead of her leader. John stood alone on the rooftop, staring at the rising shattered moon, contemplating his situation. Oh, John, a voice called out, laughing all the while. John's head snapped to the source of the voice, and to his shock, he saw Carden climbing up onto the roof. I couldn't help but overhear you two from my dorm room. And I have to say I am surprised. I didn't know you were both crazy and a liar. Insane hallucinations. Cheating your way into Beacon. Didn't know you had it in you. Carden. John growled out. Now. No threats. Carden held up his scroll. Don't want me to send this recording I took to the headmaster, do you? A smug grin appeared on Carden's face. He thought he had John by the balls. But there was no sign of fear on John's face. No desperation to keep his secret hidden. Only pure, unadulterated rage. Carden, you will delete that recording, forget everything you just heard, and never bother me or my friends again. John snarled. He would give Carden this one chance to turn around, despite how much he wanted to eviscerate the fool then and there. Carden's smug expression fell, becoming one of dumb acceptance, as he deleted the recording. I didn't hear anything, and I won't bother you or your friends anymore. Carden then backed off, climbing back into his window as if he was never there in the first place. John nodded with a smile, believing he had successfully intimidated Carden into backing off. It felt good to see Carden run away with his tail between his legs like that. Having had enough of this location, John turned around and started to make his way back to his dorm. As he made his way back, John paused. Thinking on the memories, on the series of events that led him to his current predicament, John thought about the mask. He had thrown the mask into his locker at the start of classes, and hadn't interacted with it since. He couldn't understand why, but he wanted to see it now. He needed to see it. Making his way to the locker room, John made his way down to locker 636 and inputted his code. The locker popped open revealing Crocea Morse, and John's traveling pack. Opening up the bag, John dug through his supplies, and at the bottom found the bone mask. Despite what John said, about not wanting to become like whoever once wore this mask, he knew he couldn't forsake it. Despite his resolutions, his declaration, he couldn't tear himself away from it. Its allure was too strong, and the young Jaune Arc did not have the strength to resist its call. The mask did not want Jaune to limit himself, to limit his emotions. It needed Jaune to be stronger. Lifting the mask up in front of him, he whispered, "It's yours, isn't it? The memories. The powers." Jaune reverently raised the mask, as if expecting a response. "What are you?" As expected, Jaune heard nothing. But that wouldn't deter him. There was something more to this mask, and he knew it. That night, Jaune did not return to his dorm. Instead, he found himself alone in an empty classroom. And until the light of the next day shone through the windows, he stared deep into the mask of Darth Nihilus, desperate to unlock its secrets. Chapter 6. Leadership. Monday. Focus, Mr. Arc. Project your will over the chalk. Professor Goodwich commanded. "I am focusing." Jaune grunted out through grit teeth as he focused his semblance over a single piece of white chalk. After classes were finished, Jaune had gone to his first after-school lesson with Professor Goodwich. As he entered the classroom, he could feel both the pitying looks of students who thought he was a dead man walking, as well as the jealous glares of the professor's secret admirers. To his surprise, the extra lessons were relatively normal. The professor had given Jaune a simple task for his first test, to use chalk to draw basic shapes on the blackboard with his semblance. At least, Jaune thought it was simple until the first stick of chalk he mentally grabbed onto exploded in a cloud of white powder. It took Jaune 2 more failed attempts before he was able to correctly dial in the amount of force to grab the chalk and lift it up. But that was only step 1. Figuring out the correct amount of pressure to apply to the chalk against the blackboard proved similarly irritating. Too much, and the chalk would be crushed against the board; too little and he would barely be able to write anything. In all honesty, it was an interesting problem and a creative use of his abilities. But it would be far less aggravating to do if he wasn't so fucking tired. Jaune's eyes had dark bags underneath them, and he had the classic headache and irritability that came with pulling an all-nighter. Last night, Jaune had snuck out of his dorm in the middle of the night in order to further study his mask. It had become an obsession of his recently, one that he knew his team wouldn't understand. The possibility of understanding what was happening was too much for him to just ignore. So Jaune used every minute possible, pushing his body to its physical limits to study the mask. As such, an exhausted Jaune Arc was in his first private lesson with Glinda Goodwich, feeling half dead and woefully unprepared. The chalk slowly creaked up the blackboard, forming an unsteady line as Jaune dragged it up. Several seconds of desperate struggle later and soon Jaune had created a poorly drawn triangle that looked like something his younger sister would have drawn with crayons. Jaune dejectedly sighed. The drawing looked like crap and it only made him feel like crap. Suddenly, he felt a reassuring pat on his shoulder. He turned to see that it was Professor Goodwich attempting to comfort him. "Despite how it looks, Mr. Arc, this alone shows improvement. Remember, this is not a test of your artistic skill, but to work on your fine control without having to resort to your emotions." Jaune had also told Glinda how he believed his powers were connected to his emotion. As such, Glinda decided to have the boy learn how to use his abilities without having to resort to such a volatile method. "Yeah, I know, Professor." Jaune sighed once again. "It's just frustrating. Using my semblance like this, it just feels weird or wrong. I'm not entirely sure how to explain it." Jaune shook his head. Trying to use his powers without feeding on his emotions was like trying to swim without using his hands. It was possible, but exceedingly difficult. Glinda put her thumb and index finger to her chin in contemplation. "Well then, perhaps we are approaching this the wrong way. Can you explain to me, step by step, the process in which you are currently using your powers?" Her idea was that by having Jaune explain it in specific details, one of them would be able to pick apart whatever inefficiency was holding him back. Jaune paused for several seconds, trying to figure out how to verbalize what he was actually doing. "I know I have to stretch out my feelings, if that makes sense. I feel that the chalk is there, even though I'm not actually touching it. Once I have it, I sorta tell it what to do. I think go up, and the chalk lifts up. I think lighter grip, and the strength of my semblance's hold slackens." "So you have to actively think on each step of what you're trying to do?" Glinda asked. Jaune nodded his head. Yeah, pretty much, since I'm trying to do this logically rather than emotionally. Glinda tapped her chin. That does seem rather inefficient. She paused for a moment, until inspiration struck. Have you tried using your abilities visually, rather than sequentially? John tilted his head in confusion. What do you mean? Immediately Glinda switched into lecturing mode. Your current process allows you to focus on what specific action you are doing, but it also causes tunnel vision. You focus so much on what you are currently doing that you do not see the bigger picture. If you can only think about lifting the chalk, you can't also think about pressure and angle as well. So rather than thinking of what the next step you need to do is, try to imagine the action as a whole, to feel your way through the drawing, letting your unconscious mind control the small details, rather than rationalizing and controlling everything. The professor finished. John rubbed the back of his head, confused to say the least. I'm still not sure if I get it. Glinda did not sigh, nor was she disappointed that John did not immediately understand her. She was, after all, first and foremost an educator. Think of it this way. When you are running, do you specifically think about how your heel falls onto the ground first? Then do you have to think about how your weight rolls over your foot, followed by thinking about pushing off with the ball of your foot? At the same time, do you have to think about breathing harder to get more air, or swinging your arms to be more efficient? No, but you are able to do these instinctively. You may have to think, I want to run, but the action of running itself is automatic. So instead of taking it step by step, controlling each small action, think about what you want to draw in its entirety, visualize it in your mind, then simply do it. John nodded his head. The analogy helped make things clearer for him. So taking a deep breath in, John cleared his mind and extended his senses. He closed his eyes and focused on nothing but the chalk. Inside of his mind he visualized an image of himself, drawing on the blackboard. He drew several shapes, a square, then a triangle, followed by a circle, and finally a smiley face. Opening his eyes, John was able to fully appreciate his work. Now decorating the chalkboard was a drawing of a simple square house, with a triangle roof, and a circular sun in the sky with a smiley face in its center. It was still a bit of a childish drawing, sure, but darn it, it looked great. Straight lines, a perfect circle for the sun. John felt like he might as well drop out of Beacon now and go to art school, he thought it looked so beautiful. Impressive. Most impressive, Mr. Ark. Glinda congratulated. John smiled. Positive reinforcement was always rare for him, so he'd take it whenever he could. Thanks. Your advice helped a ton. And John meant it. There were many possible applications of this exercise. Having the ability to reliably use his semblance without relying on his emotions would limit the risk of him going out of control. Indeed it did, but I was not the one drawing. It was your determination that saw this through. Though I must ask, a smiley face. Glinda raised an eyebrow. John meekly laughed and rubbed the back of his head. I guess I just thought it was cute, he murmured. Glinda's face remained impassive. Quite. Well, Mr. Ark, I believe that this is where we can stop for now. There is such a thing as overtraining, after all. John nodded his head. All right, well thanks for everything, Professor. I guess I'll see you next week. He turned heel face and made his way for the door with a spring in his step. Oh, and Mr. Ark. The professor called out as he left. John stopped and turned. Do try to get more sleep. Our field trip to the Forever Fall Forest is this Friday, and it will not do to have you exhausted in the field. Glinda's neutral teaching face shifted into a commanding glare. John immediately gulped and turned his head, avoiding eye contact. Yeah, of course, Professor, no problem. The young Ark turned and got out of that room as fast as he possibly could. Tuesday. John felt a cramp in his hip as he sat cross-legged on the dormitory rooftop. It wasn't a severe pain, but annoying enough. He wondered if this was a sign that he should start adding in some mobility exercises to his training routine, after all. John, are you paying attention? Ren called out, sitting in front of his team leader in the same stance. Pyrrha sat next to John as well, mirroring them while Nora dozed off by the door. Yeah, of course. John wasn't, but he didn't want to lose face. If Ren saw through his lie, he didn't mention it. Remember, close your eyes and breathe naturally, no need to control it. John silently grumbled. He wasn't thinking about controlling his breathing before, but now that Ren mentioned it, he was completely aware of it and was now breathing manually. Ren continued on with his lesson. As you begin to meditate, let your mind drift. As wandering thoughts and sensations enter your mind, do not judge or think deeper on the thought, but simply be aware that it is there. This type of meditation will help bring you a deeper awareness of the world around you, and help you control your reaction to them. When John and Pyrrha brought up the issue of his dreams and lack of control to Ren and Nora, they were not judgmental or skeptical, something John was eternally grateful for. Ren was more than happy to volunteer his services to help John take control of his instincts, and as such began teaching him the basics of mindfulness meditation. The focus of the meditation was to have John practice experiencing the present without judgment or emotional reaction. Which, of course, was far easier said than done. All honesty, John found meditation beyond boring. But he knew that Ren was doing this for his best interest, so he promised he'd try his hardest. And an arc never goes back on their word. John cleared his mind, and extended his senses outward, letting him feel the world around him. Unbeknownst to him, however, due to his connection with the Force, his senses extended far beyond what would normally be possible. The young knight could sense Ren and Pyrrha beside him. Despite his eyes being closed, he could see the burning magenta and crimson of their auras. He could even see the pink of Nora off to the side, albeit dulled in her sleeping state. John smiled, grateful that he had such a great team who'd go so far for him. However, in order to stay true to the exercise, he flushed the thoughts out of his mind. He simply acknowledged that he could sense his team, and moved on. As his mindscape returned to blackness, John let his mind drift again. Soon the sensation of color was then replaced with buzzing. It was faint, so John willed himself closer. Within his mind he could see a swarm insects on Beacon's ground level, several stories below him. The bugs flew in a cloud beneath an amber-leafed tree, landing on a recently deceased bird, no doubt making the most out of their surprise meal. At first John felt pity for the black-feathered bird, but he strangled that reaction down as well. John simply acknowledged this as part of the circle of life, and left the scene. Before John could pull himself out of this meditative state, he felt a final pull on his senses. John's mind turned back to the school, back to the locker room, into a specific locker all too familiar to him. The mask. It was calling to him. Pushing past the locker door, through his bag, John saw the mask lying at the bottom of his bag. As soon as the ivory artifact appeared, everything else vanished from his sight. It was just him, and the mask. John held back any reaction and simply thought, okay, the mask is here. He then tried to leave, but found himself unable. Before, he could simply banish the thoughts of what he was sensing and wait for the next sensation, but he couldn't hear. In the void of his mind, John sat alone with the mask. He didn't know for how long he was there, but he felt the mask peering into him, through him. It was overbearing, suffocating. John felt as though the gravity was turned up by 100, crushing him within his own mind. It was in this suffering, that John swore he heard the mask whisper. John. Pyrrha cried out as she shook John out of his trance. Huh, wah. John slurred out as he was violently pulled out of the meditation. It took him a few seconds to recognize he was back on the roof, with both Ren and Pyrrha standing beside him with looks of concern. What's going on, guys? Ren and Pyrrha shot each other a glance, before Ren answered. John, we finished the meditation session a full minute ago, but you didn't open your eyes. Pyrrha called out to you and you didn't react either. What happened? John pondered on what he just experienced. I was meditating, I think. I got super in-depth with it, focusing on the world around me, seeing it even though I'm not there. John shrugged. Or I might have fallen asleep. To be honest, I'm still a little confused with the way this all works. John weakly chuckled. Pyrrha frowned a bit while Ren's face remained impassive. Well, if that's true, then congratulations. Achieving such a deep meditative trance on your first try is impressive. Is it? John genuinely asked as Pyrrha grabbed his hand and pulled him up. Ren nodded, so John flexed his bicep and sarcastically gloated, well, that just goes to show how badass I am, getting it on the first try. It's also getting pretty late, so why don't we all head back? Ren and Pyrrha were unsure of their leader's answer, but would not push the topic if Jaune didn't want to talk. They respected his privacy too much. So the team moved to awaken their slumbering Valkyrie and return to their dorm. Wednesday night. Ren stirred in his sleep. Despite being perpetually tired, Ren was actually a rather light sleeper. Such a thing was a necessity when living with a young Nora, whose penchant for violent pranks forced him to always be vigilant. Something was moving in his room. Ren creaked an eye open, and could see a male figure in the darkness. Quickly he was able to place the silhouette to Jaune's body. Ren watched as his leader stealthily crept out of the room, silently opening the door and exiting. Part of Ren wondered what Jaune was doing, but it was far too late in the night for him to care. So Ren went back to sleep, leaving Jaune to do whatever business he needed to do. Meanwhile, Jaune was quietly making his way through Beacon's empty hallways. He knew that the school didn't have security cameras from his previous expeditions, but he still needed to be stealthy. After all, he didn't want to accidentally alert any FanFic students. He didn't want anyone, especially his team, finding out about his nightly trips. If they found out, they might think he was crazy. Or even worse, they might try to take the mask away. This was his secret, and his alone. So as he had done previously, Jaune covertly arrived in the Beacon's locker room. And as he had done previously, he retrieved the mask and spirited himself away to an empty classroom. Jaune placed the mask on the ground and kneeled in front of it. When he did his meditation with Ren yesterday, Jaune swore he heard something from the mask. He was finally hearing something. He was close, and he knew it. So close to finally getting some answers. So Jaune carefully held the mask up, as if it were made of glass. Jaune then closed his eyes and began to meditate. Once again Jaune projected himself into the void of his mind. This time he was alone, with no mask. "Please, show me more," Jaune cried out internally. There was no reply. "You're listening, aren't you? You're there, I know it. What are you?" Jaune needed to know. He needed to see more memories. He needed to learn how the man fell. If he could learn what happened to him, he could learn how to avoid becoming like him. Jaune continued to scream into the void to no avail. Jaune's eyes shot open as he left his meditative trance. Despite having the mask in his hands, he heard nothing. Jaune's grip on the mask tightened as he felt his anger rise. The boy snarled as he threw the mask in fit of rage. The artifact flew out of his grip and smacked against the marble wall, falling to the ground completely undamaged. "Fine. Keep your secrets," Jaune roared out. The wooden benches and desks around him groaned as telekinetic pressure was forced upon them. "I don't need them. I won't become like you because I'm stronger than you. I am going to be a hero, not a monster." Jaune slammed the door open and turned to leave. As he did, he stopped. He heard something. Jaune peered over his shoulder and looked back at the mask. It was a quiet, unintelligible murmur, but he knew he heard the mask whisper. Silently, Jaune turned around, and picked the mask up again. Thursday. Jaune felt the sweat drip down his brow as the afternoon sun beat down on him. Sword held high, the young Ark faced down his partner Pyrrha, who stood wielding her own Ch.4. "Again, Jaune, begin," the champion called out as she stepped forward to attack. Pyrrha stepped forward with an arcing vertical slash. An attack that Jaune easily parried and dodged by stepping off to the side. Twisting his blade, he moved to counter-attack with a horizontal swing to Pyrrha's torso. This was in turn blocked by Pyrrha, who then spun into a low spinning kick, aiming to sweep Jaune off his feet. Ark saw this coming and jumped in the air, but as he did, a dull thud sounded out from behind him. As Jaune landed, he turned and saw that the medicine ball he was telekinetically holding up had fallen to the ground. Jaune sighed as he realized the grip he had on the 8-pound ball was disrupted. Jaune and Pyrrha were not actually sparring, as Pyrrha had said that she felt his skills in swordplay were good enough already. Instead, what they were doing was a drill that Pyrrha's coach had taught her in order to learn how to use her own semblance during the stress of combat. Like all of the training Jaune had been subjected to this week, the exercise was simply in theory but difficult in practice. Jaune and Pyrrha were in fact performing a choreographed set of strikes and counters, all while Jaune had to hold up a weighted medicine ball up with his semblance. The drill was physically and mentally draining for John, and splitting his attention between the combat and his semblance was particularly difficult. Despite John's dejected mood, Pyrrha smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "There's no reason to look so down, John. You made it up to the third strike on the first day of this training. That is quite remarkable." John smiled and put his hand over hers. "Thanks, Pyr." Pyrrha blushed slightly and pulled back. While she didn't know if she'd say she liked John yet, she would at the very least say she was intrigued by him. Sure, it was his lack of knowledge on who she was that attracted her in the first place, but his good-natured attitude and confidence that kept her looking. Pyrrha always felt insecure about talking to others due to her celebrity status and lack of experience just talking to people. But John was always more than eager to jump into a conversation with faux bravado that was more cute and humorous than anything else. If anything, she was a little bit jealous of John's ability to form new relationships so easily. And Pyrrha thought that the fact that John had a firm butt didn't hurt either, as she subtly eyed him up and down. John's already athletic build was only becoming more sculpted as he spent his time at Beacon training. Even with his uniform on, she could see more muscular development. Something else then caught her eyes, however, and it wasn't John's cute butt or broadening shoulders. It was his face. His face was paler than normal. John was always light-skinned, but the color in it seemed to have faded. And beneath his eyes were dark bags. Even his stance seemed shakier than normal. Pyrrha asked with concern, "John, are you doing okay?" John raised an eyebrow, as if he was confused as to where the question was coming from. "Yeah, I guess I'm a little tired. Have you had anything to eat yet?" John paused to think. He spent lunch meditating, trying to reach out to the mask from his dorm. "No, I had to skip lunch. But it's fine, I'm not hungry." Pyrrha frowned. "That's not good, John. Our bodies need fuel if we are to push them. We're ending practice here and going to the cafeteria." "But," John tried to argue. "No buts." Pyrrha was now in coach mode. "Either you come with me to eat now, or I knock you out and force feed you." "Understood." John felt a shiver of fear through his spine. He stood up ramrod and saluted. "Yes, ma'am." Pyrrha nodded with a victorious smirk, and the duo left for the cafeteria. Once there, it didn't take long for either of them to get their food, as it was still a little early for dinner. As they met up, they heard a voice call out to them. "John. Pyrrha. Over here." They looked over and saw that both Ruby and Weiss were also enjoying an early meal in the cafeteria. The Arcos duo made their way to the White Rose and sat down with them. "You, watching your weight there, John?" Ruby asked with a chuckle. Pyrrha was confused at the question, until she looked down at John's tray. It consisted of only a small salad and a single piece of buttered bread. Hardly a hearty meal. "No, just not that hungry." John shrugged. "So what are you guys doing here so early?" Ruby smiled and wrapped an arm around Weiss's shoulder, saying, "Well, me and my BFF Weiss here." Weiss groaned at the descriptor. "Have been coming up with some training regimens. Different combo attacks we can do, areas each of us can improve, stuff like that." "That's wonderful," Pyrrha responded. "We ourselves have just been going through some of John's semblance training." "Oh, and how's that going?" Ruby asked as she stuffed her mouth full of food. "Don't talk with your mouth full, you barbarian," Weiss scolded. Pyrrha ignored their spat and continued. "Very well. John is a wonderful learner. In all of our lessons, as well as the lesson with Professor Goodwich, he's been excelling quite well." Pyrrha beamed with pride for her partner. John smiled and put on his confident, faux bravado face once again. "Yep, it's not easy being a prodigious hot stuff like myself." John joked. "Speaking of hot stuff though." John's gaze then shifted to Weiss. "Oh my God," Weiss grumbled out. While Weiss did not have an initially negative view of John Ark after initiation, his constant attempts at flirtation quickly worked to lower her opinion of him. She was here to learn and train, not start a relationship, and this was something that John couldn't seem to comprehend. Meanwhile, Pyrrha felt the fork in her hand bend for some reason. "You wanna head out into town this weekend, Snow Angel? A new Sylvester Stallone film just came out, Rainbow, Last Blood. Thinking we could go see it, maybe get some dinner beforehand." Weiss felt the migraine she had from the beginning of the term returning. Normally she would chew Ark out for these repeated annoyances, perhaps sick her family lawyers on him, but seeing as he was Ruby's and Pyrrha's friend, she'd be diplomatic about it. No. Weiss flatly responded before returning to her meal. Ah. John groaned as he hung his head in shame, his playboy facade once again broken. Ruby, sensing the awkwardness of the situation, decided to ungracefully shift topics. So you guys ready for the field trip to the Forever Fall Forest tomorrow? I know we are, ha ha. Ruby let out a weak laugh as no one else at the table seemed to respond. John shrugged, his head still hanging low. Sure, but I mean it's just a field trip. What's the worst that could happen? Ruby groaned and threw her hands back. John, why would you say that? That's bad luck. Weiss cut in to stop her partner's antics. Oh please, that's superstitious nonsense. In my experience, there's no such thing as luck. John added on. Ruby gave John shocked expression at his betrayal, while Weiss had a satisfied smirk at winning the conversation, even if it was with John's support. Thursday night. John once again crept out of his dorm in the middle of the night. As he closed the door, however, something unexpected occurred. John, what are you doing out here? A voice called out behind him. John's head immediately snapped around, and he saw Ruby in her pajamas, a black tank top with a heart-shaped Beowulf head, and white pants decorated with pink roses, holding a plate of cookies and a glass of milk. That caused him to raise an eyebrow. Midnight snack? He asked, pointing at the treats. Ruby flushed red and put her snack down. Yes, I mean no, I asked you first. She pointed at him accusingly. John gave a weak laugh and lied. Just going for a walk. Ruby didn't say anything for a second. Does your team know you're out? That question caught him off guard. Maybe. Ruby frowned, and that hurt John's soul. His big brother instincts always told him to protect her, not make her sad. Ruby then walked up to John and sat against the wall, motioning him to sit as well. John sighed and sat beside her. John, do you know what it means to be a leader? Ruby asked, her pure silver eyes looking right into him. Is that a rhetorical question? John tilted his head in confusion. No. Ruby responded, popping the P. John then took the time to think upon the question. A leader is someone who gives orders and that everyone else follows. Ruby shook her head. Anyone can just give orders, John. But only leaders can inspire, to make others want to follow. But to do that, leaders need to communicate with their teams, not hide away in the dark. John felt his anger rise up a bit at the accusation. I am not hiding. He hissed out with more force than he realized. John cursed at himself internally. Ruby was someone he never wanted to hurt, never wanted to direct his anger towards. How could he ever even think of yelling at her? Anger was quickly replaced by shame. Ruby, however, wasn't fazed. Then what are you doing out here alone? John opened his mouth to respond, but found nothing coming out. He couldn't think of a good answer to tell her. As John failed to come up with a response, Ruby sighed and stood back up, making her way to her dorm. Good night, John, I'll see you tomorrow. As Ruby retreated back into her room, John found himself alone in the darkness of the hallway. He looked down the hall, towards the lockers, towards the mask, and then back at his dorm where his team lay sleeping. John rested his head on his knees, frozen by his own indecision, not knowing what to do. Chapter 7. Fear. Thursday evening. Following the end of their early dinner, John and Pyrrha bid their farewells to Ruby and Weiss as they split up to return to their teams. The RW duo left for the gymnasium where Blake and Jaune were training, while John decided to go back to the rooftop to do his meditations. This left Pyrrha to return to the dorms alone. Opening the door to her room, the champion was greeted with the sight of Nora jumping on her bed, bouncing in the air while Ren was cleaning his pistols. As Pyrrha walked in, Nora turned to her and called out, Hey Pyr. Where's John? I thought you guys were training. We were. But we stopped early for dinner. Afterwards he wanted to go do his meditations, so I returned ahead. Pyrrha replied as she took a seat on a short bookcase by the window. All John does now is his boring meditations. I wish you hadn't taught him that, Ren. Nora complained mid-jump. They are for his own good, Nora. Ren gently chided while polishing his weapon. However, Jaune does seem to have become rather scarce ever since we began his training. Well, he just wants to become the best huntsman he can be. And such a goal can only be achieved through hard training. Pyrrha defended her partner's absence. Ren silently contemplated. There is such a thing as overtraining, however. And his habit of sneaking out at night will not help him recover. That's weird. Doesn't he know we need our rest? We do have our field trip tomorrow. Nora proclaimed as she tucked in the air, somersaulting and safely landing on her bed back first. He does what? Pyrrha exclaimed, the volume causing Ren's hand to slip off his pistol. Ren and Nora quickly shared a glance as Pyrrha stared at them dumbfounded. Pyrrha, Jaune has been sneaking out all week. Ren said plainly as the champion's jaw dropped. What? How have I not noticed? Pyrrha practically shouted. Well, all cards on the table PYR, you're kinda a heavy sleeper. Nora somewhat bashfully said as Pyrrha immediately went red. As in like, every night you clock out like a rock. All honesty, it wouldn't surprise me if it took a grim attack to wake you up, you're such a deep sleeper. Okay, thank you Nora, I understand. Pyrrha cut her off before sighing. The champion knew that she was a heavy sleeper. Hours of constant training in her youth taught her to get what sleep she could whenever she could, but she never knew it was that bad. But right now the conversation was not about her sleeping habits, but about her partner. Do you have any ideas as to why Jaune would sneak out? Nora shrugged. Maybe he's going out for midnight snacks. I know I do that sometimes to make pancakes when Ren refuses to. Ren could only sigh at his partner's casual confession. Pyrrha thought on this, but then immediately dismissed the notion after remembering the meal her and her partner just shared. Perhaps, but I don't believe that is it. In fact, have either of you noticed what Jaune's been eating for his meals? Nora gave the champion a confused look, while Ren thought for a moment, but was similarly unable to come up with an answer. Jaune told me that he skipped some meals, and when we went to dinner he barely ate anything. Just a salad and some bread. Pyrrha worriedly explained. Loss of appetite, lack of sleep. Those are worrying signs. Ren added on. Is he ill, or perhaps suffering from depression? What? Jaune's depressed. We can't have that. Nora cried out as she leapt out of her bed, immediately ready to rush to her leader's aid. Wait Nora, we don't know anything yet. Pyrrha intervened, stopping the Valkyrie from doing anything drastic and seating her back down. Jaune. We don't have any proof that Jaune is depressed. But, I do feel as though he's hiding something. There's something going on with him and he's keeping us at arm's length. Pyrrha dejectedly admitted, hanging her head. PSSH, well silly, the way we solve that is easy. Nora waved off her concern. It's obvious we don't know what's going on inside of Jaune's head, so we just have to crack it open and see what goodies are inside. Pyrrha looked at Nora horrified, before looking to Ren for an explanation. She means that we should confront Jaune directly about this. Ren translated. Pyrrha's eyes widened. Nora, we can't just ask him. This seems personal to him. Everyone is allowed to keep things to themselves. Despite her desire to help Jaune, Pyrrha knew the dangers of pushing and prying into someone's personal business. One wrong move and they risk insulting or hurting Jaune, causing him to become even more withdrawn than he already was. Then your plan is to say nothing, hide away your worries, and hope that Jaune can resolve his inner turmoil himself. Ren deadpanned with a raised eyebrow. What? No. But Pyrrha didn't actually have a better alternative. Alright, fine, you make a good point. The huntress acquiesced. Alright then, let's go ask him. Nora once again stood out of bed. Wait. Pyrrha cried out again as she grabbed Nora's wrist and yanked her back. Nora tried to resist and escape, but the champion twisted her teammate and threw her onto her bed. She then jumped atop the pink bomber and pinned her down. What is it now? Nora complained as Pyrrha brought her full weight down on her. Need some time to think. To prepare myself for this conversation. So how about tomorrow? We can ask him while we're on the field trip. Pyrrha tried to bargain. Nora's eyes narrowed on the red head. She then glanced at Ren, who met her gaze and only responded with a shrug. Fine. We wait until tomorrow. But you better not chicken out, or I'll let John know that you like to stare at him during Professor Oobleck's class. Nora threatened. Pyrrha immediately went red. How did you know about that? Her gaze often found itself on their fearless leader during class, but she had thought she was subtle enough that no one would notice. A mischievous grin appeared on Nora's face. I didn't. Until now, that is. Pyrrha's mouth gaped like a fish, trying to form a response to the extraordinary chess move Nora just outmaneuvered her with. It was then that the door swung open, and the topic of the conversation entered the room. Hey guys, what's with all the ruckus? John called out as he was greeted with the sight of a red-faced Pyrrha currently pinning Nora down onto her bed while Ren watched. The silence that followed was physically painful. To his credit, John kept most of his composure, save for the reddening of his own face as he slowly moved to close the door. You know, I don't mind if you guys want to do stuff. But at least put a sock on the door or something. This isn't what it looks like. Pyrrha cried out as Nora burst out laughing while Ren could only sigh. It was going to be a long night for Team JNPR. Friday. Teams RWBY, JNPR, and CRDL all sat in a single bullhead as the airship made its way over the Forever Fall Forest. Sitting in the front of the cabin was John, who was currently trying to meditate and focus on anything else besides his motion sickness. Pyrrha was patting his back from a seat away, vomit bag in hand just in case. Team RWBY along with Ren and Nora sat in the middle of the cabin, casually chatting, while Team CRDL sat in the rear, alone but docile. Their advisor, Professor Goodwich, sat in the cockpit along with their pilot, a woman named Ash. As Nora and Ruby chatted about the types of Grim they hoped to see, Young noticed her partner Blake sneaking peeks at Team CRDL behind them. Team CRDL's bigoted, bullying attitudes were well known, and Young knew that Blake at least sympathized greatly with the Faunus. Everything going all right there, Blake? Young called out, getting her partner's attention. Blake's head snapped to the yellow brawler. Yeah, I'm all good. Just keeping an eye on Team Testosterone over there. I want to make sure they don't do anything stupid. Blake smirked. Young grinned at her partner's joke. Blake was normally quiet and reserved, so jokes from her were a rare commodity. I get what you mean, those guys are real blowhards. She shrugged, but at least they seem to have calmed down recently. Much to the surprise of Team RWBY and PNR, after Cardin and John spat in the cafeteria, Team CRDL stopped nearly all interaction with the two teams. Previously, in some vain effort to prove their superiority, Team CRDL would often try juvenile tactics to either intimidate or harass their teams. But for reasons unknown to them, CRDL had become far more passive, even going out of their way to ignore them now. Yeah, small victories I guess. Blake agreed. They even stopped their harassment of the Faunus students. Normally I'd say this is a good thing, but this was so sudden that I don't know if I believe it. Well, Vomit Boy did put the fear of the brothers into Cardin during their duel. Yang said, pointing her thumb at John, who groaned near the front of the aircraft. Good thing too. Because if he didn't I would've. Those guys are creeps. Blake smiled at her partner's supportive, albeit violent demeanor. I know you would've. I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking this. Yang smirked. I mean, that is kinda your thing. Blake rolled her eyes and gave Yang a light punch on the arm. Oh, shut up. As the two laughed at the small argument, back in the front of the plane John felt his stomach lurch. He bent over, and felt a supportive pat on his back. Are you okay, John? Do you need the bag? Pyrrha brought the paper bag to his face. No, I'm good. John laughed off the wave of nausea as his head rocked back and forth with the turbulence. Pyrrha looked at John's face and saw that the dark bags under his eyes were still there, combined with an expression of more tiredness than sickness. She frowned, knowing that she had to confront him about these self-destructive habits. Suddenly the bullhead lurched downward and began its descent into the Forever Fall Forest. This time John did need the bag as the sudden movement disrupted his meditations. Pyrrha then decided she would definitely wait to ask until they were outside, in the fresh air, after John had a few minutes to waft the smell away. A creature stirred in its burrow. It had not moved for years, for it did not need to. Unlike the inferior creatures that lived above, it did not require food or air. And so it simply waited, hibernated. But it had awoken now. Strange. It extended its senses through the ground, and felt a disturbance. There was something here. Something that it hadn't sensed in many centuries. Its favorite prey, a force user. A force user so powerful in the dark side that it could awaken the creature from its slumber. And so the creature began to dig its way out of its burrow. The temptation of killing this prey and feasting upon its flesh was too much. As it burst its way out of the underground and into the scarlet forest, it turned its head to the east, and began to make its way towards the group of unsuspecting students. Yes, students, the forest of the Forever Fall is indeed beautiful. But we are not here to sightsee. Professor Peach has asked all of you to collect samples from the trees deep inside this forest, and I'm here to make sure none of you die while doing so. Professor Goodwich called out to her students from the front of the pack. All three teams were walking through a beautiful forest with ever-crimson leaves that gave it a fantastical atmosphere. Every student carried their own mason jar as they naturally separated into their own teams. Stopping to face them, Professor Goodwich held a jar full of red sap. Each of you is to gather 1 jar's worth of red sap. However, this forest is full of the creatures of Grimm, so be sure to stay by your teammates. We will rendezvous back here at 4 o'clock. Have fun. She deadpanned. And so the teams broke apart and began stabbing their nozzles into the trees, letting the red, viscous liquid slowly fill their jars. Unsurprisingly, Team CRDL went off on their own, disappearing into the tree line to no doubt lollygag the day away. As teams RWBY and JNPR continued to fill their individual jars, with double the amount for Nora as she continued to eat the sap as they collected it, Pyrrha stood and made eye contact with Ren. Ren caught the gesture and nodded, stopping Nora's snacking and making their way to their teammates. John, do you have a moment? Pyrrha called out to her leader. John, who was in the middle of filling his jar, looked up to his partner and smiled. Yeah, what's up? Would you mind if we talk for a bit? Just us? Pyrrha asked, gesturing to Nora and Ren behind her as well. John glanced at his team, his eyes narrowing and the smile falling off his face. Yeah sure. Don't see why not, ha. John's voice was wavering and shaky. Normally he would trust his team with his life, but the unexpected ambush instantly set his paranoia on edge. He had no idea what his team wanted, or why they wanted to talk away from Team RWBY, but he didn't like it. As Team JNPR walked off, their exit elicited curious glances from Team RWBY. What's going on with them? Yang asked no one in particular. I don't know. Wai said, crossing her arms. Whatever it is their team's problem, and we shouldn't butt in. Yeah, I suppose. Yang shrugged and went back to filling up her jar with the others. Meanwhile, Ruby watched John and his team leave, and a small pit in her stomach formed. She hoped that he would be able to work out whatever was going on between him and his team. Once Team JNPR believed they were out of earshot of the other teams, they stopped and faced their leader. So, what's going on? John asked, the jovialness normally in his voice now gone. Ren, noticing the increase in hostility of John's tone, stepped forth first. Relax John, we're only here to talk. About. John curtly replied. John, what's going on with you? His partner Pyrrha asked as she stepped forward. You've been staying out late, not focused in class, you've barely been eating and sleeping. John, please, if something's wrong, let us help. His partner begged. John scowled and turned away from them. I'm fine. I've just been training. There's nothing wrong with me. If there was nothing wrong, you wouldn't be sneaking out of our dorm at night. Ren flatly dropped. John's eyes widened at that revelation. He'd been seen. Damn it, he should have been more careful. Of course Ren would notice him leaving. John cursed his own stupidity as he realized his team would not be giving this up, not when they had proof of his odd behavior. Alright, John finally relented. It's the memories, he confessed. The ones you've been seeing in your dreams. Nora asked, remembering the John's explanation of the dreams he'd been having when he asked them to help train. John nodded. Yeah, those. Look, the meditations are helping me. Like, a ton. They're helping me understand this power I have now, helping me understand the man whose memories I'm seeing. John knew he was close. So close to finally having an understanding. He couldn't stop now. That's what I've been doing instead of sleeping, instead of eating. I've been meditating so I can finally understand what's happening to me. Perhaps you are close. And while understanding is good, knowing the root of your own powers won't do anything to help you if you die from exhaustion. Ren sagely countered. John shot Ren a glare. What Ren said made sense, but he could be lying. He could be jealous of his powers, and doesn't want John to fulfill his true potential as a warrior. Ren wanted him to fail. John felt his anger rise up, boiling inside him. He almost felt like he was going to reach for his blade and strike at Ren when he turned back and saw the looks on his team's faces. They were worried, scared expressions, not for themselves but for their leader. John then shoved his anger back down inside of him. No, Ren wouldn't do that. Ren is my friend. John thought to himself. They're all my friends, and just want to help me. You're right. I'm sorry guys, I guess I have become a little obsessed with this. I promise I'll take better care of myself, actually eating and sleeping. John promised. The rest of his team gave a big smile at this, and Ren nodded his head in approval. That's all we ask. With a blinding speed, Nora then wrapped up the rest of her team into a bone-crushing group hug while crying out, and Team Ch.4 is back together. The rest of her team, unable to breathe, responded with pained smiles while she continued. Now that all that junk is out of the way, how about we? Help! A voice cried out from deeper in the forest. Immediately Team Ch.4 broke apart and drew their weapons, scanning for the source of the noise. From deeper in the forest they saw three familiar figures running for their lives, Russell Thrush, Dove Bronzewing, and Skylark. What's going on? John called out as his grip around Crocea Morse tightened. A monster. Russell screamed as he sprinted. Huge one. And it's after Cardin. Turning to the direction where Team CRDL was running from, Team Ch.4 saw the braggart of a leader Cardin running from the most terrifying creature they had ever seen. It did not have the classic black flesh and white bone armor that Grimm had. Nor was it the shape of any Grimm that they had seen in Professor Port's class. The creature was tall, somewhere between 3 to 4 meters in height, bipedal but with short stubby legs and two extremely long forearms that it used to walk on all four limbs. It had a brown, almost insectoid-like carapace, covered with spines, and on the edges of its arms were 4 massive claws larger than any Ursa claw. Its head was long and flat, protruding backwards with a frill that gave it the appearance of a 3-pronged kite shield. The image was completed with a maw of razor-sharp teeth, and 2 sharpened tusks in the side of its mouth. Team Ch.4 froze. None of them knew what this creature was. The beast was terror incarnate, a vicious killing machine that made any of the Grimm they've faced so far look cuddly. John felt a primal fear grip him. This thing they were facing was a predator, and he was its prey. John did not know where he drew his next words from, nor did he know what they meant, but he spoke them with a mixture of fear and respect. A Terentatek. The rest of his team looked at John, confused as to what he just said, before Cardin's scream brought their attention back to the fight. Meanwhile John was conflicted on what to do. It was no secret that John fucking hated Cardin. And he would lose no sleep if he watched the bully die a painful death. But John wanted to be a hero, and that meant going in and saving everyone he could, regardless of how he felt. And so John stood still, frozen by his internal conflict and indecision. Unable to come to a choice, soon a choice was forced upon John. In his panicked running, Cardin fell, tripping over a root as the Terentatek caught up and raised a mighty claw to finish him. And it was at that moment, John did not think. He did not think on his hatred of Cardin, nor his fear of the beast. Before he realized what was happening, his body moved off of instinct. With a semblance-enhanced leap, John shot forward. Focusing his power in both his hands, he extended his left hand and pulled Cardin away from the beast as he landed between them. In his right hand, he charged up all the power he could muster, focusing on blasting the beast away. He extended his palm and the most powerful torrent of telekinetic energy he had ever used blasted right for the creature. The trees behind the Terentatek buckled and cracked under the force, and anything not rooted to the ground was blown away by the attack. Everything but the Terentatek, who seemed to be unaffected by the force-based ability. Ark's eyes went wide and his jaw dropped. His most powerful attack, and the creature shrugged it off like it was nothing. The Terentatek's terrifying eyes focused on Jaune, and he swore he saw it grin. Jaune didn't feel what happened next, as it was too fast. Almost immediately Jaune was launched in the air as the Terentatek's claw slashed him across the chest, sending him flying. Ark's body ragdolled and smashed into a tree, nearly snapping his back as he then fell to the ground. Jaune. He heard Pyrrha cry out in the most terrified scream he'd ever heard. Jaune tried to push himself off the ground, but found that all his strength was gone and his vision hazy. Looking at the dirt, it was stained red by an ever-growing puddle of blood. Jaune sputtered out a muted cry as he looked down and finally began to register the pain. The Terentatek's claw strike not only shattered his aura in one hit, but sliced through both his armor and his abdomen. A jagged cut was torn through the length of his torso that poured blood and other bodily fluids. Jaune swore he saw chunks of intestines falling out as well. "Oh, that doesn't look good," is what Jaune wanted to say, but as soon as he opened his mouth, blood poured out like a fountain, resulting in a garbled gurgle. As the pain set in, Jaune found himself unable to move. His body stopped responding, the slightest twitch sending mind-breaking pain through him. He felt a burning, sizzling pain as his blood began to clot, coagulated by the Terentatek's poisonous claws. Jaune could only focus one thing, the sheer terror at the realization that he was going to die here. "No!" he heard Nora cry out as she charged the creature with her hammer. Pyrrha, who wanted nothing more than to run to her partner then and there, instead turned to Ren. "Ren, get Jaune. Now!" Before she then turned to join Nora. Yes, Pyrrha wanted to save Jaune, but she knew that between her and Ren, she was the far superior fighter, and their chances of survival would be much higher if she was the one in battle. The Terentatek was able to take 2 steps towards their leader before a massive hammerhead smacked it on the side of its face. The explosive slam forced the beast to stop, but didn't seem to really hurt it. Nora took a step forward to hit it once again, but she was then yanked backwards by Pyrrha, who took several shots fired dust shots at the creature's face. Ren dashed for Jaune, his semblance working overdrive to keep him calm. Reaching his leader's unmoving form, he flipped Jaune over and his face fell at the damage. The monster had all but eviscerated Jaune, tearing through his stomach, destroying several organs, and causing the boy to lose liters of blood. Immediately Ren tore off his sleeve and began wrapping it around the wound. He then pressed both hands on it to try and stem the blood flow. NNN. Jaune groaned as Ren pressed down on the wound. "Don't talk, Jaune. Save your strength, we'll handle this." Ren said as much to calm himself as well as his leader. "And Nora," was all Jaune could whisper as he then pointed a single finger to the sky. Ren's eyes widened as he realized what his leader was trying to say. "Nora, fire your grenades into the sky. Now," Ren yelled. "What?" Nora called back, confused at the seemingly random request given their situation. "Just do it," Ren cried out, his normally calm demeanor completely gone. Nora nodded, transforming Monhild to its grenade launcher and fired off 2 grenades into the sky. They exploded with 2 pink clouds above their position, creating makeshift flares for the others to find them. Jaune saw the trailing pink explosions in the sky and hoped it would be enough of a signal for help. He then felt a tugging on his collar as Ren began to drag Jaune away from the battlefield, giving Ark a full view of the fight. Having seen the damage that the Terentatek had outputted, destroying Jaune's aura in one hit, even Nora was forced to play it safe. Pyrrha danced between the monster's strikes, using her superior agility and battle sense to stay in close quarters, while trying to cut and thrust her way through the chitinous armor to no avail. At the same time Nora would circle around, staying on the creature's backside repeatedly firing grenades at it as Pyrrha distracted it. Jaune watched this all occur, and felt pathetic. He was an idiot for trying to save Cardin, or at least an idiot for assuming his powers would knock the Terentatek back. It was a stupid, amateur mistake that nearly killed him. The frustration and anger at his own mistakes welled within him. It mixed and melded with the sheer pain and agony he felt, fueling something within him. Meanwhile, Pyrrha continued to battle like a warrior goddess as she hacked and slashed at the monster. Rage and lust for vengeance fueled her strikes, while discipline and training kept her from overextending. However, such a style of combat would always be in the favor of the Terentatek, as a single mistake would be lethal for the red-headed huntress. And such a mistake would come. Pyrrha retreated a step, narrowly dodging a powerful strike as the Terentatek's claw stabbed into the ground. Its hand stuck. Both Nora and Pyrrha dashed forward with weapons raised high to capitalize on the situation. But before their strikes could land, the monster pivoted, turning its spike-covered back to the huntresses. The girls separated, dashing to the side to avoid impaling themselves, but the monster seemed to have predicted their evasion. With a mighty swing of its arm, the monster aimed its claw right for Pyrrha. The champion was barely able to raise her shield in time as the Terentatek savagely clotheslined her, sending her right into the ground. Pyrrha felt the air get knocked out of her lungs as she landed on her back, stunning her and taking a chunk out of her aura. The Terentatek, however, would not give her the time to recover. Raising its claw up, the beast speared Pyrrha's position to the cries of Nora and Ren. But to its surprise, it once again impaled the dirt. This time, however, the ground was covered with rose petals. The monster's momentary confusion was broken as a large chunk of ice crashed onto its head, shattering on impact. The beast turned to direction of the attack, and was met with a new batch of prey. Standing between Jaune and the Terentatek, Team RWBY stood defiant, weapons drawn and ready to fight. RWBY carried Pyrrha in her arms, having swiftly saved the champion from certain death using her high-speed semblance. Beside them, the clicks of heels could be heard as Professor Glinda Goodwich entered the fray as well. The Terentatek carefully eyed the new students and professor. As powerful as it was, such numbers would be dangerous. Glinda took one look down at Jaune's bleeding form and her normally disciplined glower turned into a hateful scowl. The professor was furious that her student and new apprentice was wounded like this. "Jaune!" RWBY cried out as she helped Pyrrha up. Her face panicked and marred with worry over her friend. "Focus, Miss Rose," Glinda commanded. "We are in the middle of a battle. Miss Nikos, what is this creature?" Pyrrha shook her head. "I don't know, it came out of nowhere and attacked Cardin. Jaune saved him but was hurt. Professor, this thing is strong, it cut through Jaune's aura in one hit." Pyrrha grit through her teeth, emphasizing her leader's name. Glinda knew the implication. Jaune's aura reserves were massive, even larger than her own. Destroying that in one hit meant it would kill any of the students here in one strike as well. Immediately, Glinda began barking out orders, dropping the use of surnames to save time. "Yom, join Pyrrha and Nora in distracting the beast. Do not let it touch you. Blake, Weiss, and RWBY, focus on ranged and hit-and-run tactics while it is engaged with the others. Ren." She looked over to the Mistralian boy and her own apprentice. "Get your leader out of here." "Roger." All of the students shouted back. With a nod acknowledging them, Glinda called upon her semblance and raised hundreds of stones into the air. The stones coalesced, shifting together to form a massive stone spear that she then hurled right for the beast. With a resounding explosion of stone, Glinda was not able to kill the beast, but drew first blood as she pierced the creature's side. The professor shot the creature a baneful glare. Glinda was pissed. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and there were very few women on Remnant like Glinda Goodwich. After the professor's first strike, all of the students burst into action. Yom, Pyrrha, and Nora charged into melee. With thrusts, punches, and hammer swings, the trio tried to bring the beast down to no avail. They would only get 1 or 2 hits in each before being forced to retreat by the monster's counterattacks. Meanwhile RWBY, Weiss, and Blake kept their distance. The RWBY repeatedly fired rounds into the Terentatek's back, hoping it would fall, while Blake would launch sneak attacks with her katana whenever she saw an opening. Simultaneously Weiss focused on launching large ice rocks to stagger the beast when possible, while Professor Goodwich launched powerful telekinetic strikes as well. All the while Ren continued to put pressure on Jaune's wounds. Ren would not let his leader die here. He's lost too much already to lose Jaune as well. That's when Ren realized that the blood flow out of Jaune was slowing. His eyes went wide as he realized this meant that Jaune had more blood around them than within him. Tears formed in the corners of his eyes as he pressed down harder. No, Jaune. Stay with us. Suddenly a hand gripped Ren's forearm. To his shock, his leader grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, lifting his hands off of the wound. Ren looked at his leader in awe, as Jaune's face was not that of a weak, dying man, but instead that of a hateful warrior seeking vengeance. Ren watched as the blood flow stemmed not because Jaune was running out of blood, but because his wound was healing. Jaune's yellow-gold aura flared around his stomach, focusing and amplifying as flesh began to knit itself. The wound did not regenerate properly, but instead fused and twisted together, stopping the blood flow wherever possible while reforming muscle. Ren watched as a separate, black and red aura fused with Jaune's own golden-yellow aura, further accelerating the healing. The pain Jaune felt was immense, far beyond anything he thought was possible to comprehend. The healing that Jaune was doing was not a comforting, soothing healing that his aura normally provided, but an agonizing perversion. Flesh and bone knit because he forced it to, moving in unnatural ways that his body did not understand. Every inch of new sinew and scar tissue that formed sent waves of pain through him. But this pain and agony only served to fuel him further, strengthening his dark healing. Jaune, Ren muttered, horrified at what he was seeing. What are you doing? Through grit teeth and excruciating pain, Jaune responded. Using my semblance to force my wounds closed. Jaune didn't know how his semblance was doing this, or why his aura seemed to amplify as well, further increasing his healing, but he wasn't going to question it this very moment. Go Ren. I'll be fine. Help them fight. Ren looked at the battle, which was not going well in favor of the huntsmen. Despite their numbers, they seemed to lack the power to bring the beast down. He then looked back at his leader, who writhed on the ground in sheer agony. Go. Jaune snarled at him. Nodding, Ren stood up, drawing Stormflower and moving to join Blake in her hit-and-run strikes. With Ren gone, Jaune continued to focus on his pain, muscle and skin rebuilding in a misaligned fashion, but he was no longer in danger of simply bleeding to death. Suddenly a large crash beside him briefly took his attention as he watched Yang Xiaolong get punched through the same tree he hit. Looking her over, Yang was now heavily wounded. While she was able to block the attack with her right arm, the strike shattered the limb instantly, as well as breaking her aura. It was only thanks to her semblance that she survived, but even her glowing yellow hair turned back to normal as the monster dealt more damage than she could absorb. She was effectively taken out of the fight. She glanced over to Jaune, saw that he was conscious and moving, but was also swimming in a pool of his own blood. Hey Jaune, how you doing? She asked through a pained groan and small smile. Jaune actually laughed at the absurdity of the question. Oh not bad. Just bleeding to death. How about you? Yang grimaced. Bastard hits hard. Broke my arm and my aura in one hit. She glanced at her twisted limb, then at the severe wound on Jaune's chest. She glared at the Terentatek with renewed determination. But I'll be fine. Just hold on tight, Vomit Boy, we'll get you out of here. Yang grabbed her broken arm and yanked it hard, resetting the bone. Through the pain she stood, staggering off to the side, firing shotgun blasts from her left arm to support the others. Back to the battle, Pyrrha had disengaged from close quarters, having narrowly escaped death too many times. She retreated beside RWBY, and the two peppered the beast with dust rounds. As the Terentatek moved towards them, Ren and Blake shot forward, rushing it from behind and digging their weapons into its ankles. The strike actually seemed to wound the monster, as it stumbled forward before trying to hit them with a lumbering swing. The two ninjas were able to jump back and retreat, dodging the clumsy attack. As the Terentatek turned around to swing at them, both Glinda and Weiss smashed it with a boulder and ice rock respectively. The attacks broke upon its chitin, stunning it. All of the huntsmen and huntresses were exhausted, breathing heavy as their auras and physical bodies were pushed to the absolute limit. Meanwhile the Terentatek still stood strong. They were chipping away at it, but this was a creature of the dark side whose very flesh could deflect blaster bolts. It was then that the students heard a new combatant enter the stage. The engines of the bullhead that had brought them here roared above them, as the airship's chin-mounted machine gun and wing-mounted missile pods were activated. "This is Bullhead 479er, contacting Professor Goodwich. Did somebody call for 15 tons of badass?" The pilot called into Glinda over her scroll. Professor Goodwich smiled. She had contacted the Bullhead for emergency support after she saw Norris grenades in the sky. "Ash, it's good to hear you," Glinda called out over speaker. "We have a high-priority target on our position and need immediate fire support." "Roger that, Glinda. Danger close, salvation coming your way." The pilot coolly said. The rotors on the Bullhead's chain gun spun up. The Terentatek looked up as the Bullhead's weapons opened fire. With a deafening BRRRRRRT, the monster was slammed with hundreds of 20mm dust rounds per second. Even the Terentatek had to raise its arms to protect itself as the high-caliber rounds began shredding away. Missiles then fired from the wings of the airship, high-yield explosions further rocking the beast. "Now students, hit it with everything you have," Glinda roared out as she called upon the last of her aura to raise as much earth as she possibly could. The students surrounded the monster, weapons all in ranged form, as they repeatedly fired all of their ammunition. Dust rounds, fireballs, and pink grenades all combined fire with the sole purpose of destroying this creature. Meanwhile, literal tons of stone and earth was lifted by Glinda Goodwich as sweat dripped down her brow, straining under the load. Suddenly, she felt the weight lessen, even though more stone was still being lifted. She glanced to her side, and saw that Jaune limped his way beside her, and was now levitating several tons of stone as well. With a shared nod, they combined their powers to form the largest stone spear they had ever seen. The jagged javelin of earth flew forward, impaling the Terentatek in with an avalanche of granite. The Terentatek stumbled backwards and Huntsman continued firing. Even after the beast fell to the ground, they kept firing, the overwhelming and unrelenting attacks pulverizing the entire area. Dust and poisonous green blood shot through the air as the Terentatek cried in its death throes. As the cries stopped and the dust settled, the huntsmen waited with bated breaths to see if they were victorious. When the smoke dissipated, all they saw that remained of the monster was a mangled corpse, dead and mutilated by their attacks. The students dropped to the ground in relief upon seeing their foe defeated. The adrenaline fading from his system, Jaune then collapsed completely, his consciousness quickly fading as Professor and all of his friends rushed to his side. The last thing he remembered seeing before passing out was their worried faces and the Bullhead descending from above.